So in this section we're taking a look at web services and SOAP, XML, HTTP, and how we can call from a mobile phone running Android, running our own custom application, how we can call a web service, how we can retrieve the response in XML, how we can send the input in XML format as well. So what we have here is Microsoft Visual Studio running Internet Information Server. And the basic idea here is that we have code written here as C# that is basically running under the .NET environment that has function or method number 1 called Hello World, and it has a method number 2 called Hello World 2. So the first one requires 0 input parameters and the second one requires 1 input parameter. Now in this example we have the mathematical equation to convert between meters and miles. So 1500 meters is roughly 1 mile, about 0.9 miles. And so what we can do is to write an app under Android that calls this web service. Now, keeping in mind that a web service can do anything that a .NET application can do. Contact Microsoft SQL Server. It can be written in VB.NET. It can be written in C#. So as long as we can call this particular example, we should be able to call any other web service written in Microsoft Visual Studio as well. So let's stop and take a look at this in action. We have the service WSDL, the list of things that this web service can do. Hello World, if we click on that, it shows what would happen if we were to invoke it. So in the Android environment, we could send a SOAP request in this format, expecting a SOAP request that comes back in this format. So let's try this out. We're going to click on the button to invoke it. And this is what we should see coming back to the mobile phone. Now another scenario, if we go back and look at the Hello World 2. So this is the converter between meters. So if we put something like 1,500 meters, that's almost a mile. The answer comes back 0.93. So this is what we should see coming back on the mobile phone also. And from the mobile phone we can send a SOAP package that looks like this, expecting a SOAP envelope that comes back looking something like this. So now that we understand the basic purpose of the web service, we know it's written under Microsoft Visual Studio, either C#, VB.NET. We know that it could connect to business objects, it could connect to Microsoft SQL Server, SharePoint Server, it could connect to the whole world. It can do anything that we need it to do. So as long as we can connect to Hello World from the mobile phone and Hello World 2 from the mobile phone, we can connect to anything else bridging through the web service. So let's take a look at how that works. So we're looking at the Android mobile development environment, and we want to take a look at an example that we might find in a corporate enterprise application. So let's say that we have a web service that's written in Microsoft Visual Studio. It connects to anything. It might connect to IBM DB2. It might connect to Oracle. It might connect to Microsoft SQL Server, SharePoint services. There are a lot of things that we can connect to. So assuming that we're using Microsoft Visual Studio as the web service authoring environment and VB.NET or C#, let's say that we want Android to be the mobile phone operating system that we expose a user interface to. So in a multi-tier environment, in-tier developer environment, we would have a back-end database like SQL Server. On a front end, we can use the mobile phone. And for the in-tier piece in the middle, we can use business objects. All this is possible if the Android mobile phone can make an XML HTTP request to the web service. So as long as this works, we can do all other things as well. So for example, we'll start off by using Microsoft Visual Studio to develop the web service. That includes VB.NET, C#, and the user interface will be Android. A couple things to keep in mind. It's the web service client. We will specify in the header for the HTTP request that the content type is text/XML and that the character set is UTF-8. And that's important because some SOAP headers require UTF-8. And the XML HTTP request object is very common in most browser environments. It's very easy to code against with JavaScript as well. So let's take a look at how this works. We'll build a sample application under Android mobile phone development that calls our Visual Studio web service from the Android platform. So now we're back in the Eclipse developer environment for Java. We're building a mobile phone application for Android, and we'll choose File, New, Project, Android Project. We'll set up this project name. We'll set the platform at least level 4. The application name, package name, the activity, and we can skip the next step. So let's collapse the project that we looked at before, and we'll focus on this project, AppDev Android Web Service Project. And we'll start out like we have before by modifying the values for the strings. And we'll place the 3 asterisk. Let's save this. We'll set up the run configuration. So we want a new Android run configuration. And we'll target the connect the dots between the project and we'll say manually launch one of the emulators. So let's apply this and run. We'll choose the L4 emulator. And that looks good. So 1, 2, 3 asterisk. Hello World, AppDev Android Web Service Activity, and AppDev Android Web Service Application. So we're off to a good start here. So let's go back into the user interface. Under Layout, Main XML, and let's flip this to Landscape. Also, set the background color to white. Now, in this example, we're going to test out 2 different web services. The first one is the Hello World, and all we expect is a return value coming back and maybe a button that will initiate that process. But on the second web service, we should have an edit text to type in the values of meters and then have it call the web service to get the answer to convert that back. Now, it's not as if we couldn't also write the logic as JavaScript in a web view or as Java here in the mobile phone, but as a pathway demonstration of how to contact a web service, it works out really well to demonstrate passing in a value like a number and then getting a number back. So the number 1 test that we'll take a look at is simply calling clicking on a button, calling the first web service and getting an answer back. So what we could do is to set up that button. We'll give it an ID. And also, we'll set up a message. Let's save that. And then back in the Java code under SRC, we have this onCreate, but we also need an onClick. So here's the basic app. We're importing the log file, also the definition of a user control, a view. The on-click event is going to display begin and end. So we have this button over on the XML Android markup language side. We also want one here. We'll use this magic find view by ID function. And if the object that we're looking for doesn't come up, we can basically rebuild the project. And what that should do is under the Gen folder, it should update the synchronizing of that r.java file with the code that we've just written, and it did. So button 1, the import. So button.widget.android now is imported into the project. We'll attach the button click event to call this function. So we have the the foundation laid for the interface. We have to now declare that we're ready for that interface to be implemented. And we'll import that definition as well. So whenever we see that red squiggly, if we hover the mouse over the item, it'll actually suggest how to fix a problem. And at this point we should have a button that says begin and end. And later we'll write some code here that will call the web service. So let's test what we have. So call web service hello world. If we hold down the button, here's the on click, begin and end. So now let's make it do something. So there are a couple of ways that we can actually call the web service. There are a couple of different ways that we can invoke HTTP to another machine. And we've just taken a look at how to use the web view in the earlier section. So let's take a look at how we can utilize that learning skill that we already have to call this web service. So under main.xml, what we're going to do is to bring in a composite object, the web view, and we can drag and drop it down here. So it's nice to be able to see that here as well. So what we're going to do is to utilize the ability of the web view to use both HTTP and also the XML HTTP request object. So back to the code, we have this web view. Let's give it an ID. So in the earlier section we had a web view that loaded an HTML document locally, and we can do the same here. So here's that blank page. And we can also open it in the editor. Okay, so now this is a basic HTML document, and under the main.xml we can see that this is the component that will render and also process the JavaScript, HTTP, XML, AJAX stuff for us. So let's go back over into the Java, and we have this button click event. So we take the reference to the web view, we'll call it web view 1. So on the reference to r.java at this point, we're missing the web view. And let's try that again. We should actually see it now. There we go. So we plan to use JavaScript inside that object, so we'll set this value to true to turn it on. It's a permission setting. So if we go back to the Project Explorer window, and we're looking for this AppDev, Android, Web Service Client file. And that looks good. So let's test this at this point and find out how close it is to working. So we'll hit go. And under the log file, let's watch what happens. And so that looks good. So there's no errors here. We have the on-click for begin and the end. And we also have this little message that says Hello World, Web Service Client AJAX. So that's actually the rendering coming out of the web view, which is nice right now because we can use it for debugging purposes. We can keep it if we like it, if there's something useful there. And also we can visually hide it if we want to not display to the user what's going on in that web view. We could just borrow it for its as a black box for HTTP and XML. So let's close this. And we'll make a change. Instead of a local file only, we want to be able to go out onto the internet or to any other machine. We want to use the network. looks good. So we have this app. We have both the shell of it is running in Android, Java, Android markup language, and then nested here we have this little Ajax component that we can use for Ajax stuff like web services. So let's go back into the Java code, and here we go. So we have this click event that basically triggers the fact that this local HTML gets loaded, and now this can just be a shell that hosts the Ajax component, and we could go over to the Ajax piece and we'll add a little bit of JavaScript. And we could call this test1, hello1, something that basically is generic, because we can make a couple of these functions to test stuff out. So in this example, we'll put a span around this word world so that we can update it programmatically. And we'll reference that from the JavaScript. So that calling this function in JavaScript, we'll grab a handle to the span, and it'll place this message, Android. And this is how we can update the content, just to test this out, and then we can make other divs and spans that respond to the web service also. So let's test this out. We'll add another button that calls this JavaScript function, and we'll add that button to the shell, the Android Java shell. So this is that function. So we'll handle the button click event responding to this B2 XML. Let's save that and double check that the r.java gets a copy of that. So we can see that there's B1 but no B2. So now there's our reference to the B2. If we go back into the Java, so the on-click event we can attach to the both the buttons. And we'll add a switch statement. So the parameter here, the view, v1, is the button, and we'll look at its ID. So the code for button 1, we already have that. And the code for the second button is almost the same. And we could tweak that. Okay, so clicking on button number 2 invokes a JavaScript function inside this document that's already loaded inside of this web view. And when it does that, we should see the content change slightly. The change should look like this. This content here, world, should say Android instead. So let's try it out. So we'll call this reference that loads in this basic HTML document with Ajax. We'll click this, and the hello world should say hello Android, and that looks good. So now what we can do is to add the actual HTTP call to the web service. That will, in addition to just changing this to hello Android, we'll actually get some content from the web service that we can display here on the screen as well. So now we can add additional content in the function here for JavaScript. We can create a new reference to our XML HTTP object. So our XML HTTP request object can be equal to a new instance of and we can go ahead and set the properties here. We're going to open up a connection somewhere. We'll set up a header for the UTC-8, and then we'll send, in this case we're not going to send XML, we're going to basically invoke a web service that has 0 input arguments, and then we'll take the response that comes back from this and we'll place it into the span. So we'll say something like this. We'll say span 1 in our HTML is equal to the response text that comes back. So how do we set all this stuff? We're going to use the post command to send a request to some URL, and we'll set asynchronous to false, so we'll wait for the response before we move on. So the HTTP address that we're about to access is this address right here. We'll copy that to the clipboard. Remember that we're going to call this first. And we're expecting to basically get the response that we see here. So we're sending in a SOAP header that has no parameters. We're getting back a SOAP response. So for the content of this, let's pass in a parameter rather than nothing. Let's put SOAP1 and we'll create the content for that. Actually, for this one, if we were to go right into to save some time on this example, if we were to go right to this URL with the operation hello world, that would also work, because here's the output, and if we grab this URL, we'll come back and look at the SOAP headers on the next button click, because the next button click does require that we send in content. So we'll skip that for this point. We'll come right back to that on the next step. So rather than the URL that we currently have, we're going to change that. So it drills down into that specific method called hello world, and if all this works, we should have a the header. So some of the web services require UTF-8 specifically, and sometimes we can see that. Here we go. So the encoding here, it's requiring UTF-8. If we use a Unicode 16-bit character set, sometimes it doesn't work right. So let's save that. The response text we're going to put inside of the span here. So let's close the program and let's restart this and see if we can make it work without crashing. Okay, so let's try this again. So let's go ahead and try restarting this emulator and see if we can run the application that we've been working on. And we'll run it within a clean, fresh emulator from scratch. Okay, so now that we have this emulator up, let's go ahead and launch the application through that emulator. So this error message, adb.exe, has stopped working, means that we may need to restart Eclipse and possibly even restart the whole machine and reboot Windows. So here we are, we just rebooted the computer and we're back in Eclipse. Let's try this out. We have the L4 emulator up and running, and we'll hit go. So here we have the call web service hello world, and what that does is to load the AJAX code that we need. The next step is to call the AJAX function, and what we expect to see is hello Android, but then also the XML response. We're not getting that second part. If we look at the code here, hello Android, that part's working, but something after that's not working. So what we can do is to break each of these steps of lines of code out and put a little debugger note to figure out where it's stopping. So we could do something like this. OK1. OK2, OK3. So when this crashes, it's not going to crash the entire mobile phone, but what it will do is just stop running the JavaScript. So we're looking for a message that will give us a clue at what point that the application stops. So we'll hit call web service. There's the HTML AJAX file. We see hello Android. So we're not even getting to this point. Now if we look back at this object name, it is case sensitive and it may actually be lowercase HTTP. So capital H, capital R. So this loads the AJAX file off the local file system in the phone. And now we got farther, we got past OK1, we got past OK2, but not to OK3. So let's double check this command set request header. So looking at this one line of code, we see the reference to this method call set request header, content type text XML. Now, although we're setting a single header, the name of the method is actually plural. So it's set request headers plural because there are multiple headers on the HTTP request, but this method's setting a single header at a time. So let's try this out. We'll hit save, we'll hit go, 54. We'll hit call. That brings up the AJAX file. And we're back up to OK2. So we've gotten this far in the code, and there's something still that's crashing on this one line of code on set request headers. So let's double check one thing. Let's do a clean on the project, and we'll do a build. So we'll bring in the AJAX file, and we're still stuck on that OK2. So we'll go back to the code and take a look at this logic here and figure out what's wrong. So we're stuck on this one line of code. We've gotten into the function call for appdev Android hello 1. We're basically setting up this pointer to span 1. We're setting it to Android. That works. We instantiate a new HTTP request object, and that works. We're setting up the post command, and that works, and this is where the code's stopping. We're not getting to this point right here. So back to this one line of code, XHR1 set request headers. The actual header will show up like this inside the formatted HTTP document and the HTTP request of the transaction. But the way that we actually specify this is by setting up one parameter for the name of the header, comma, and then the actual value of that header. So even though the if we looked at the raw transaction, we would see this as one line. The way that the parameter is set up is that we send this as two parameters. So let's save this. We'll try it. So there's the AJAX file. And now we got past that step, we're up to step number 3. So back in our code, we've just managed our way through this hurdle right here. We're down to here. And we're stuck right here not getting this response back. So let's take a look at how we can fix that. The first thought when we made this is we were going to send a SOAP envelope, but we changed that halfway through, and we said just go straight to this web service method call because it doesn't have an input argument. Therefore, we wouldn't need this either, and we will use it when we create the next function, because the next function does send the SOAP header. So here's our AJAX file. Oh, there we go. We got to the message OK3. So let's do this one more time. That was a delayed response. So to figure out where we're actually at, we'll make a code change. We'll hit space. That'll cause the Eclipse development environment to rebuild the project. And it will send it back to the phone. The phone will restart the app, and we'll do it one more time. So here's our AJAX file. That worked pretty fast. And the reason for that being so fast is that it's picking it up from the local memory on the phone. And that's one of the advantages to building an HTML5 application with all the HTML in the assets folder, is that the latency is very quick. So we're up to step 3 still, with a little bit of a delay. So we're getting closer to the response that we're looking for. So remember that the goal here is to invoke a web service from the Android mobile phone, and the path that we've chosen to accomplish this is with the XML HTTP request object. Now, the advantage to this path is that it's browser or it's mobile phone cross-platform. It will work on each platform. So one of the problems that we're facing here is the fact that the location of the web service and also the location of the JavaScript code. So to understand why this isn't working, we need to understand a little bit more about cross-site scripting permissions. So what we're going to do is to employ a method of installing a JavaScript file on the same server as the web service, and that'll allow us to fit within the permission constraints of the client side. And basically what happens is that the web service server address, the domain, needs to match the location that the JS is coming from. And there are a number of different ways that we can accomplish this, and this is just one of those, but there are a number of other options as well. So for more information on this, take a look at the jQuery library online and take a look at how they've solved this same problem. So we're looking at the onClick event inside the Java code of the Android mobile application. Now remember that this is the onClick that responds to a button click event from the Android markup language from the mobile phone application. So that's the shell around the web view. And also keep in mind that button number 1 is going to invoke this load URL to bring in the HTML5 application inside the window. This button number 2, is going to make a function call into the HTML5 application coming from the shell, the Java application running here. So let's take a look at this. We have this web service running on a different server at this IP address, at this folder name, and the web service is basically in the same folder as this HTML5 screen. So let's take a look at this. We're going to flip over to that window with this IP address of 1.133. And now we're looking at Microsoft Visual Studio on that other machine running the web service. So this is how we can invoke existing ASP.NET web services from the Android mobile phone. So Android.htm represents an HTML5 application that we build within the Microsoft Visual Studio environment here, ASP.NET. And in this example, we see the HTML document, we see the body of the document, and we see this little text. It says our message is something. Now we're using the span so that we can update it by ID, and message is the value that we're starting with. So let's pause here and let's flip back over to the other machine and take a look at what happens when we invoke this. And we want to see this message change after clicking on the button to invoke the web service. So let's minimize this window and we'll pull up a Firefox browser. Here's that message. We want that to change after calling the web service, and if this works under Firefox, we can then load it inside the Android mobile phone application. So we click on the button and we see the message coming back from the web service. It says hello world. So this basically in a nutshell is the HTML5 application that we want to embed in our Android mobile phone. So now let's take a look at this in the Android mobile phone. In the Java development environment, we can set the dirty flag, we can save this, recompile it, and send a fresh copy out to the phone. So here we go. This is the Android markup language with button number 1 and button number 2. Button number 1 loads the HTML5 application here on the screen. Button number 2 is basically identical to the button here inside the HTML. They both call the same JavaScript function. So when we click the button, we see the web service returning Hello World from the Microsoft server running ASP.NET, developed with Microsoft Visual Studio. Now also, let's try this again. If we refresh that area right here with a fresh new HTML5 window, and from the Android button, notice we can also invoke that same web service. So before we work our way over onto the Visual Studio box, let's take a look at button number 2 under Java in the Android environment. So what we're saying is we want to invoke a JavaScript function called appdev_android_hello1. So that's inside of the HTML5 page. So if we flip over to that server and look at this android.html, and we look at the code here under the JavaScript, that's this function here. We can invoke this function from the Android shell application. So notice that what this does is to grab a pointer to the span inside the HTML of the document. So when we look at the message here, we see a span that has an ID of appdev_android_span. So that's this span 1. Also, we're going to reset the content inside of the span. We're changing the HTML formatting, and that replaces everything between the opening and the closing span tags. So let's take a look at this file, service.cs. We already have it open here at the top of the screen. And this is the message that we'd like to see, Hello World, displayed inside the mobile phone. And the next step that we'll take a look at is the content of this JavaScript file that handles the web service call from the mobile phone. So under the android.js file, we could see this command called appdev ajax command, and it actually gets invoked from 2 different entry points. But before we take a look at those 2 entry points, let's take a look at the code here that makes it work. So first of all, we have a SOAP envelope, and basically this is the request set up in a SOAP envelope. And we know the layout of a SOAP envelope by looking at the Visual Studio WSDL for this. So we're looking at the method call Hello World. We're looking at the SOAP 1.1 interface for that. And basically we could just copy and paste this chunk into our application and use it from the client side from any application actually. And then down below we see the expected format for the result, and string is going to be the string from our web service, and Hello World result is the tag name that we're going to have to search for in that XML response. So let's take a look at that. So this is that content that we copy and paste. And then if we look at the way that we actually send it, we use the standard AJAX object XML HTTP request. And we use the syntax here for post. Remember that the difference between a post or a GET has to do with the actual content that we're sending, because a GET will package all the parameters on the URL, and the post will actually let us send a file inside that request. So we set this header that says that the UTF character set is UTF-8 because many of the web services will not function correctly if they're defaulting to UTF-16 or any other format like Unicode. We also set the content length to the length of this string that we're building here dynamically. And we set the SOAP action to actually point to the specific method that we're looking at. So as long as that works correctly, the value here will not be null. Then we can send the SOAP data, that's this data here. And then if that works correctly, we can look at the response that we get back, parse it out. We can say that the node list here is equal to get elements by tag name. Now there should just be a single instance, but it is an array. So we look at the first child or the first item in that array, that node list. And then we can say result node content.data, and that's the actual message that we're getting back from that web service. So when we say return, we're returning that text string to one of the two entry points that called on it. So if we look at the HTML, we know that the button here calls appdev Android hello1. That's this function. In turn, that calls the AJAX command for the web service. Now there's another way to get to this same function. Remember, if we go back over to the Eclipse box, this is also the button in the Android markup language calling that same function, which then indirectly calls the web service to get the same content displayed on the screen.